Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. It's good to be with you again this week. Welcome back, folks. Another Friday night in the big town. I should turn down the music while I talk. That's how this works. I misspoke in our last episode, probably our last two episodes, where I said we would have an episode last week, and I misread the calendar. That episode is actually today, right now. We have a very special guest. We have Professor James Davenport, who is the Associate Dean for Social Sciences at Rose State College here in Oklahoma City. Or is it actually in Oklahoma City?
Technically, it's Midwest City.
Midwest City.
Yeah. In
the Oklahoma City metro area.
Yes.
Well, Professor Davenport, thank you for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here. Big fan of your podcast and the work that you do. So,
well, thank you.
It was an honor to get invited.
Yeah. Well, we had your compatriot Emily Stacy on the show a while back, and I know you and I have had a chance to connect several times, and you and Emily have a podcast as well.
Yes, Not My Generation.
Right.
And it's a very interesting take on politics. We look at national, international, state, and local stuff, but it's kind of with a generational take. So Emily is millennial.
Right.
I am Gen X, and so we kind of look at it from those different perspectives, as well as the younger Gen Z, boomers, that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's kind of fun.
That's great. I was born in March of 81, so I think 81 is like the line, right? So I'm an elder millennial.
Yes.
That
you know the nickname. Emily has told you the nickname that you guys have, right?
The Zennials? No. What's the? You're
a geriatric millennial.
Oh, that's right.
I love to use that with her.
That's funny.
Yeah.
She and I aren't that far apart in age, I don't think. That's great. I've listened to a couple of episodes of your show, and it's always enjoyable. You guys are both enjoyable. I hope our listeners find you enjoyable as well.
I hope so too. I hope they don't get bored or get upset at you for inviting a raving libertarian onto your show. You never know what will happen. But
that's exciting. No, I don't. I was thinking about that. I don't know that we have had a libertarian on the show before. I feel like we must have at some point. But we try to present all perspectives here. Yeah. I have a number of friends who are registered libertarian and have run for office under that banner, and we align on some things. Ranked choice voting is one. We don't align on some other things. That's what it means to participate in civic life, right?
It is, and just as far as so your audience understands, is there's actually different variations of libertarians out there as well. And I'm
just like there are the two major parties.
Exactly. I'm going to put them in two camps here. You have kind of the what has been termed not too complimentary, but kind of the libertarian brutalists. So this would be the folks from the Ayn Rand school of libertarianism. Okay.
Yep.
I get mine, you get yours. Leave me alone. I should never have to support any government program. Taxation is theft, all of that kind of thing.
Right. Ron Swanson, shut the government down.
Right. And then there is what has come to be called the bleeding heart libertarians, which are not just focused on freedom of the individual, but also take seriously issues of justice, right? And say, how can we address? They don't deny some of the things that you see denied in some of the libertarian or even conservative circles as being important issues,
right?
And how do we grapple with those, right? And so if you were to categorize me in one of those two, I'm probably more of the bleeding heart libertarian than I am the and if people want to know more about that, there's a blog that it's not active anymore, but it's still up. It's called bleedingheartlibertarianism.com, I think, and they can go and check it out.
Yeah. How interesting. I really appreciate you sharing all of that. I'm probably not, like most folks, not as familiar with the nuances of the Libertarian Party as I am the two major parties, and honestly, as I am with independents, which is where my current alignment is. Although in 22-ish, maybe 2020, there was a bit of a shift that occurred in the National Libertarian Party, right? The Mises Caucus folks came in.
So these are going to be more of the hard kind of libertarians, I think you would say. They have more of a fusion. And this has been kind of the I don't want to say a civil war, but kind of this back and forth within the Libertarian Party over the last few years is there are some who have said, look, we have had this kind of overlapping relationship with conservatives and focused on that and not focused on, and this all came out of really kind of the Cold War era type of thing. And so libertarians made their common cause with conservatives because they were both against socialism. And then, but more recently, within the last couple of decades, there have been some that saying, look, that relationship is not as productive as everybody thought it would be. And maybe we should be more open to looking where we have overlap with those on the left. And that's kind of been a rising thing, but there's been this back and forth. And right now, at least as far as the official party is concerned, it's more of those folks who are still aligned with conservatism that are running the show.
Interesting. I was last year, I think, I was on a panel with Angela McArdle, who's the national chairwoman for the Libertarian Party now, who's kind of part of this group. And the panel was about working together and like building bridges. And there were some of my co-panelists when they got the list that were like, I'm not sure how this is going to go. And of course it went fine. It was, she was very polite but it was interesting hearing different perspectives. And that was really the catalyst for me to like do some research about, who my co-panelists were going to be and what this conversation might be like. And I think a lot of people probably assume that the Libertarian Party is a flank of the Republican Party, but that's not entirely
true. Yeah.
True.
You do have people who sometimes move back and forth. But interestingly enough, on some of the major, especially social issues of the last couple of decades, libertarians have been much more aligned with those more of the progressive stripe. So you think of same-sex marriage, you think of drug legalization, criminal justice reform. Libertarians have been much more aligned with those on the left on those issues than they have been on the right.
Right. That's interesting. And things like same-sex marriage, right? Like if the generic default position of a member of the Libertarian Party is government, leave me alone, then it makes sense for the government to not be involved in saying who can marry who, right?
Right.
So that's where the alignment comes from.
Exactly. It's that notion that, as I like to try to explain it to people, libertarians are about trying to maximize individual decision making, and as opposed to collective decision making. And so when you think of government in terms of who gets to make decisions for whom, that question about who gets to marry, libertarians would say, well, that should be a question left to individuals, not to some collective body of others who really don't have any kind of consequences that they pay if they get it wrong.
Right. So I'm not trying to get you to speak for libertarians writ large, but I'm curious now about some other issues like book bans that we hear a lot about in the news right now. My hunch or suspicion would be let people read the books they want to read, but if I'm wrong, tell me so.
No, that very much would be, from a libertarian perspective, is, again, the government should not be about deciding for you what it is that you want to read or listen to or consume in some other way, right? That should be, unless what you're doing causes direct harm to another person, that the government has no business in interfering with that.
Right.
And so I think libertarians would be much less inclined. Now, you get into this whole thing of, and this is where, again, there can be some nuance, but, libraries are public institutions, so they're automatically government, so somebody's going to decide who's going to do what. But by and large, libertarians are going to say, just let people read what they want to read. Right.
Which seems like a reasonable position to me. And related to that, we had Dr. Reverend Shannon Fleck on the show a couple of weeks ago, and she and I are planning a follow-up episode. Listeners, I know some of you have clamored for more. You'll have plenty more. Don't worry. We just have to find time. And we talked a lot about the separation of church and state, right? And so where do libertarians fall?
So libertarians are very much in that camp of there should be a clear line of distinction between what is church, what is state, and they should stay out of each other's business for the most part.
Right.
Where I get when I talk about these things, politically, I come from a libertarian perspective, a distinct type of libertarian perspective, but I'm also a political scientist, so I bring that hat to
Sure.
the table.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a person of faith, and so I bring that background to the table as well. And these things don't all fit nice and neatly with each other all of the time, and so I have to kind of grapple with things as well as how does this fit within these other things that are also me in dealing with this. But by and large, I still come back to, for the most part, in most situations, people should be able to work things out amongst themselves and not have some third party impose its own decision on what they should or shouldn't do, how they should do it, that kind of thing. Again, it's kind of like John Stuart Mill, the harm principle. As long as you're not causing direct harm to somebody else, you should be able to engage in that.
Right. That's really interesting. I think when it comes to that particular issue of church and state, particularly where it connects with schools, there's a lot of, right now, I think here in Oklahoma, lots of conversations of, well, what is the role of the state government or the state board of education versus local control at the local local school board level or even the classroom teacher level? So, Superintendent Walters has proposed some rules that a lot of folks are kind of taken aback by. There's bills about requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in every school and classroom. And I'm certain that there are teachers out there that are thinking, no way. Like, I've worked really hard. I've been a teacher for 25 years. My classroom is a safe space for learning and exploration. And having anything in there is going to color that in a way that that teacher might feel is antithetical to their learning process. Or the local school board might say, listen, man, like, we disagree with this. We have a lot of non-Christian learners in this district.
Sure.
Why would we require this? We're not a religious school, right? If it's a church-affiliated school, fine, of whatever it is. And so I think that issue of just, we'll just say in general, local control versus top-down state-enforced policy, to me, is a fascinating dynamic in this state in particular that is dominated by conservatives who historically have been the party of small government, right? And now that we're debating on, well, we got it small enough, but now we want to find new ways to be big government in a way that we like, is a really, it's like a bit of a cognitive dissonance for me, I think, as a voter.
There's an interesting strain working its way through conservatism right now that has, by and large, abandoned the limited government, small government kind of mind frame, right? And have decided that no, in fact, by being limited government, by keeping a hands off, we've let these progressives just run amok and ruin everything, and so we're going to have to impose things on people because that's the only way it's going to get done, and you're seeing that more and more. And you see this most particularly in our state in issues relating to abortion, in issues relating to public display of religion, these kinds of things where you have conservatives who all of a sudden had for decades been talking about local control in school boards or limiting the government's ability to impose itself on people in various ways, now all of a sudden very much in favor of that. And so it's an interesting transition to watch this. And whether or not that strain constitutes a majority of thinking of people who identify as conservatives or not, I'm not clear about that. But it is certainly a very prominent strain that has emerged in the last decade or so. It has some various writers who have articulated this kind of notion that, no, we need to use state power to accomplish our vision of the good life, whatever that is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to watch that emerge and then see it play out in local politics. And, again, I'm not Catholic, but there's a Catholic principle called the principle of subsidiarity, which basically is decisions should be made at the lowest level possible by the people who are going to be most directly impacted by that decision.
Sure.
And I think that's a really good principle to use on almost everything. And when it comes to schools, I'm going to trust my local school board the principal of my child's school or the school teacher, I'm going to trust them a lot more to know what should be happening in that school than I'm going to trust somebody out at 23rd and Lincoln to figure that out, or in the State Department of Education even, right? Those folks know what the needs of their students are, and they've been trained in how to address those needs.
Right.
And so I think that is a good principle to hold tightly to. Even if let's not pretend like education, whether we're talking about K through 12 or higher ed, let's not pretend like there's no problems there. But even when we're saying how do we address these problems, I'd much rather have local decisions guiding that than top-down decisions from the state legislature or the Department of Education.
Right, especially things that have such a personal impact. Right. I mean, because there's no way the state board can possibly know what's happening in all of our 400 odd school districts, right? Like if you're in Idabel or Grove or Guyman or anywhere, like there's what the needs are of that community are largely only known to that community, and you might have the opportunity to speak up or to advocate for something, but to make very specific instructions down to the local level seems to me, as even someone who believes government can be a force for good, right? That like,
sure,
maybe that's not the right entity to be making some of those decisions.
Well, and as I try to tell my students in my classes all the time, we talk about the name of my course, one of the courses I teach, American Federal Government, but that's really not correct. It should be American Federal Governments because we have tons of governments, right? We have a national, state, and then all sorts of local governments. And so anytime someone says, well, the government ought to do this, well, the next question should be, which one?
Right.
Which one is best suited to handle that issue?
Yeah.
And so often we don't even ask that question.
Right. That's exactly right. And I'm reminded of that on weeks like this. As we were talking before we started recording, earlier this week, I was at a conference for my national organization, which is the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. And we had folks from 29 states that were there. And so we had at least 29 different perspectives on how government works, either like the reality of some states have ballot initiative processes, some states don't. Some that do can only do statutory changes. Some, like us, can do constitutional amendments. All the requirements are different. We talked about local campaigns, legislative campaigns, statewide efforts, coalition building with all these different verticals of groups. And I walked away thinking, America is amazingly diverse, not just in its people, but in its structures.
That's exactly right. And
for any of us to believe that there is one best way to do everything, like we have to eat some humble pie and recognize that that's probably not the case, right? There's not one way to be an American that is entirely superior in every way, especially when it comes to like how we govern ourselves. There are some systems that are more fertile for things to go poorly, right? I mean, as one example, Oklahoma's system of county commissioners has kind of widely been pointed to as like, oh, well, systems like this are prone to corruption, as we saw in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, this enormous, largest political corruption scandal in American history. And the investigator from that has said, well, Oklahoma and states like it that have this same system, like the potentiality is there that things are going to go south if you get the wrong people in office.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we've seen or struggled with over the last, 30-ish years, right? That we've had several presidents who have been elected by a minority of voters of the popular vote. But we have this system called the Electoral College that was set up for one purpose and maybe plays out in a different way sometimes. And we have to really struggle with, well, is this the right thing to do? And even today, I was in a meeting with some local advocates here, and someone made the really great point that we want to change how things are, sure, but we need to make sure we don't change them in a way that it is bad in the other direction in 10 or 20 years, right? Political winds will shift. What happens then? And then have we put ourselves in a position where we have to advocate for the alternative point just because it's a partisan issue. And I
Right,
was like, oh,
right.
that's good thinking, right?
Yeah.
We need to be proactive and not always just reactive.
The law of unintended consequences shows up often and in very unexpected ways, and so I have when I'm teaching about the Constitution, I talk about the Electoral College and describe how it emerged, what it was for, what it was expected to do, and then how it functions today. And you get a lot of folks who, well, we just need to get rid of the Electoral College. Just get rid of it, right? And just let the people vote. And so my response to that is Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Right.
Because that's what democracy has given. The Electoral College did not give us that choice.
Right.
Democratic votes,
Right.
right? Votes of the people are who forced that choice on us. And so do I think the Electoral College functions in a way that is helpful? Not really. Would I like to see some alteration? I would love for the Electoral College to become like the hiring committee for the chief executive. That's how I would like to think of it.
Sure.
When companies are hiring, when we hire for professors, we don't have one person just sitting there interviewing. We have a hiring committee that are designated, and they're going to make that decision and that recommendation and go forward. I would love for the Electoral College to function in that manner, as opposed to how it does, basically just rubber stamps whatever happens in each state. Right.
Which is, I think, this is my interpretation of what the framers wanted is something like that, right? Where arguably they were trying to pick like the elites to come together to do it.
That's right.
That's historically accurate, right? But I do think it was designed to be like, well, okay, we need to make sure that we're moving the country in the right direction. We need these people who, in their belief, might be better equipped to make it than the masses. But that is certainly not always the case either.
That's true.
And I will. We can come back to this, but I'll take issue with the idea that just Democratic votes gave us Donald Trump and Joe Biden, because I would argue that there's some structural things with how we do primaries that lead us towards
that
people.
Argument is absolutely fair, right? And that could that could lead us down to the whole rabbit hole of ranked choice voting or open primaries, these kinds of things. But you are correct, right? The way we design a system will largely determine the outcomes that system produces, right? And we certainly can look at that. I also would love to get away from the states just delegating the selection of electors to the parties. I think that is inherently problematic for a whole variety of reasons. But the first one is that it ensures that the electoral vote from any given state is not going to really reflect the vote in that state. Right.
Because it's not proportional.
That's correct. Right.
In most states, and it's tied to two major parties. Right. When there are other parties and no parties, right? Independent voters are the fastest growing segment in Oklahoma and in America. And in Oklahoma, independents are almost equal in number to Democrats now. And so it's just in like thinking of that way, it's like, well, okay, 25% of the people have opted out of both parties, or all three parties. Libertarians are a recognized party, and we don't ever talk about them in the normal discussion, right? Everything's on a binary, right, left, R, D, red, blue, when there are just as many others that aren't red or blue, and they just aren't in the conversation at all.
Right, we leave them out, so to speak, and I think that's we see that in the way the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives is constructed, and the way redistricting happens there, to where that body, I don't think anybody can argue, is fully representative of the diversity of the population. And I don't just mean demographic diversity like race or gender or such, but even ideological diversity.
Right.
That institution is not representative of the nation as a whole. And some of that has been due to redistricting. Some of it is due to the fact that the two major parties have found ways within the states to basically lock out anybody else from getting to play in their sandbox. And quite frankly, it's a little bit due to the fact that we haven't enlarged the size of the House of Representatives for over 100 years.
Right.
But our population as a nation has grown more than double in that time. So I think, all of those factors go into play about what this should be. And when I'm looking at things like this, I'm looking from my kind of my political scientist hat and saying, okay, how do we design these structures to where if representation is important, how do we make it happen? How do we decide? And these aren't new questions. I mean, they grappled with these in the Constitutional Convention of who was this national government going to represent, and how is representation going to play out, all of that. So these aren't new questions, but they're questions that we continuously have to revisit simply because of the changing nature of our population.
Right.
And I think so often we're hesitant to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I just finished reading or listening to an audiobook by Heather Cox Richardson called Democracy Awakening. Mm-hmm. I believe she's a left-leaning individual based on what I know about her. The book was excellent and does a great job of, from a historical perspective, kind of tracking trends throughout our history and in breaking down some of those compromise battles in our history of like states' rights versus the role of the federal government that I thought were very illustrative and a good reminder for us today of like where we've been as a country, how we resolve these disputes in the past, and is that resolution we came to still applicable today? Like, I think we have a hard time as Americans, like saying we were wrong about something, and to say like, oh, you know what, maybe that's not the best.
Maybe there's a different way of doing this.
Right. I mean, part of the deal, the way that we passed the Constitution in the first place was by getting guys to agree to immediately amend it 10 times, right? Where it's like, I'll sign it if you change these 10 things. And it's like, but we wouldn't agree to put it in the original document. We had to come back right away and do it. And we've amended it a couple dozen times, but certainly not for a long time.
Right.
There's some groups now working on, the 28th Amendment is what they like to refer to it as, which is optimistic, right?
That's pretty optimistic.
They can be the next one. But what a bold goal to say, hey, we've got something so fundamentally wrong. And in that case, they're talking about campaign finance reform and Citizens United. But anything like that, to get a majority of states and a majority of Americans to say, yeah, we should change this, is like a really tall order. And I think it takes perhaps a bit of humility at the same time. You can't just believe that this is the right thing to do. You have to believe that we were wrong at some point. And that I think is, especially right now, difficult for Americans to do.
I think too, sometimes it's not just about being wrong. It's just about dynamics have changed.
Yeah.
The way life works today is significantly different than the way life worked 100 or 200 years ago or so, right? And so what might have worked just fine in 1790 or 1890 might not be good for 2024. And it's not about, we don't have to come back and say, well, they were wrong. It's just things have changed.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a system that's flexible enough to accommodate that change and to apply itself to that change, you run into problems. And I think we see that today in that there's very little that we seem to be able to get done at all. Just getting normal legislation out of Congress today is problematic, much less a constitutional amendment of any sort, right? So I think sometimes we just need to step back and say, what has changed about our society? I'm probably going to get a lot of my libertarian and very conservative friends upset, but when we think about gun laws, right? Well, maybe 100, 200 years ago when we were largely rural and people weren't running into each other all the time, letting people roam around with guns freely wasn't as big an issue.
Also,
right?
the guns have changed a little bit.
The guns have changed substantially since that time. And so maybe there is a place for greater gun regulation today because of the changing technology of gun manufacturing, the more urban lifestyle that we live in. And so maybe revisiting that a little bit. That doesn't mean I want to ban guns. I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying, from just a perspective of what we thought about this 200 years ago or even 100 years ago, does that fit the society that we're living in today?
Right.
And it seems like there are some people who don't want to have that discussion. Or at least they don't want to think. They don't think about that discussion, right? It's like this is what was written, and that's written in stone, and that's what we have to do.
So you would not consider yourself an originalist in some of these things?
Oh, I vacillate back and forth. I will be honest. I don't know that I have a distinct judicial philosophy as far as the Constitution goes. I, by and large, am a big fan of the Constitution. Although I wrote a column 7 or 8 years ago arguing that we needed to rewrite it.
Yeah.
That it's time to rewrite it. That what we have now. That doesn't mean I want to wholesale give up a bunch of stuff that's in there. But there are some things that clearly aren't working today, and maybe we need to rethink about how we want to move forward.
That's so funny. When I talk about a modern day constitutional convention with people, almost everyone says, "Oh yeah, we should do that," but no one trusts the current people, right?
Correct.
To like be the ones to do it. It's like we should do that, but not these guys.
Yeah.
And of course, there's not a good. Okay, we'll just keep it where it's at then.
Well, I think when people have that reaction, they're actually correct, right? If I was designing a constitutional convention, one of the limitations I would put on it is no one currently serving in political office can serve in that convention. We're going to have people who are not embroiled in all the partisan bickering and all the partisan politics that are going on today. We're going to put them to the side, right? And let people who are not as enmeshed and who have steep commitments to one particular party or one particular ideological perspective come together and work on that. And so I think they're right in that I don't want those people doing this. I don't want them doing it either.
Right.
But I think you could work around that, right? I think you could put some stipulations on who got to serve in that.
It's really hard. And I mean, the original Constitutional Convention was not just a happy-go-lucky time, right? Like it was very contentious. It barely got written, much like many group projects.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It's tough.
And they basically ignored what they were told they were supposed to do there, right? They were told, we want you to fix the Articles of Confederation, the system that they were working under at the time. And on day one, they were like, yeah, we're not doing that. Right? You can throw all the Band-Aids and barbed wire and duct tape on those things. They're not going to work. Right. So we're just going to create something new.
Yeah. It's there's a great podcast series. I think it's just called Constitutional. And it's by one of the big podcast companies. I forget who it's by. But it's 10 episodes really walking through chronologically through the convention. And it was, I remember doing it while replacing the floor in my wife's previous house. And I was thinking like how much work it was to tear up and lay down new tile as one person, and then listening to like the arduous task of writing the Constitution, defending it, promoting it. I was like, oh, okay, tile's not so bad. This really puts things in perspective here.
You don't have nearly as many disagreements over tile as you might over how the presidency ought to be constructed.
That's true,
right?
But you can just take it out on the tile also with a hammer, and that doesn't work so well in a convention. James, you had a column last year in Non-Doc about incivility and how the title was "We Hate Each Other: Growing Incivility Undermines the Values of Our Democracy." And I feel like this conversation's kind of been circling around that. Tell us a little bit of what you meant in that.
Well, Pew Research and then a group called More in Common in conjunction with the polling firm YouGov have all done some research on how Americans kind of view each other, and especially how Americans who identify as Republicans or Democrats view each other, right? And in Pew's research, what they found is Republicans really don't like Democrats, and Democrats really don't like Republicans, and that has grown worse over time to where both sides basically see each other as enemies to be defeated, not fellow citizens who they just have disagreements with over public policy. Right. And then the More in Common study identified what they call the perception gap. And the perception gap is how much misunderstanding each party has of the other, right? And they found that that Republicans and Democrats don't really know each other anymore either. And a lot of this comes from kind of this segregating that we're doing, right? So there's been a lot of interesting research on how if you look at communities, Republicans don't live in the same communities as Democrats, and even if they live in the same communities, they don't live on the same blocks as each other.
Right.
So that's very interesting. You have habits of going to different restaurants and going to different types of churches. And so there's really this kind of segregation out. So we've separated ourselves from one another. That has caused us to not really know each other, and that has created a bunch of distrust from one another, which in that kind of environment makes it hard to find any kind of common ground, right? And what really concerned me about the YouGov and More in Common study was some of the things that we as social scientists, as political scientists, people who are actively engaged in community activities, some of the things that we tell people they should be doing actually seem to make the problem worse, right?
Right.
So we tell people, hey, get involved. We're all about civic engagement. Get out there. But the people who are most involved have the greatest misunderstanding of the people on the other side, right? We tell people, stay informed. Know what's going on. Watch the news. Well, what do we find? The people who watch the news most frequently completely misunderstand the people on the other side. Right. Even education, it can be problematic. And there was an interesting finding in that study that while for Republicans, every level of increased education didn't seem to expand that perception gap, for Democrats, it did so fairly significantly. So from college to graduate degree to PhD or something, every level you go up, their misunderstanding of Republicans gets significantly higher, which was very interesting to me. So all of these things that we tell people they should be doing don't seem to help this problem very much. And so that concerns me as a political scientist, because I don't think the answer is don't be engaged, don't be informed, and don't get an education. Right. That's not the solution to this problem, but we have to find ways of doing those things in a way that builds bridges, that brings people to the table together, that helps them identify common ground, and that we can move forward as a society on.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Recently we had a guest here on the show from Unify America that is it's a bridge building organization and trying to do some of that work. She came to meet with you. Yeah,
she was on our podcast too.
That's right.
Yeah, and they do great work. Yeah, fantastic work. Organizations like the Bipartisan Policy Center that also tries to build bridges across party lines in Congress and such. All of those organizations are really needed right now because it's just so hard for that to emerge naturally, so to speak.
Yeah. They're one of the presentations we had this week at my conference was from the National Civic League, who they, along with several other organizations, have been compiling this mega database. They've got over 10,000 organizations that are civic related, right? Some of them are trying to build bridges. There's like kind of that network of the bridging community. There's groups like ours that are working on democratic structural reform. There's a whole bunch of different things, civic education, all this stuff. And they are about to sometime in this year are going to like release it all as a data set and all as a map showing the connections between them. And it was fascinating in the talk to listen to not just how they went about collecting this data, which is just like a lot of hours of people Googling things and making phone calls, but in understanding about how they are or how we are contributing to a healthy democracy overall. And some of the questions in that session from the audience were, okay, like maybe there's, there are 10,000 organizations working on this, but is that making a difference? Because we see this slide towards incivility, increased partisan polarization, disconnect between both sides. So if we're all working this hard at doing it, like what are we missing? Like how can we do it better? If education and tuning in and getting involved is still making us more divided, like what is the solution?
And if I knew the answer to that, I'd be making a lot more money than I am today. Let me just tell you. But let me tell you about why I feel like this is a real problem is democracy, to be a functioning, legitimate system of government, relies on a bunch of stuff that happens below the surface to sustain it, right? And a lot of that is simply the ability of people to put aside their political beliefs and work together on projects. So you think of things like Rotary Club or Lions Clubs or the Boys and Girls Clubs of America or even churches or other nonprofit organizations that people come together and they say, we're going to do something in our community. We're not going to worry about each other's politics. We see a need. We're going to help with that need, and we're going to get something done.
Right.
That kind of social cooperation is essential if democracy is going to be viewed as a way to make decisions that is going to, by and large, work for the majority of the folks and not be viewed as a tool of just a sledgehammer to use on your opponents, right?
Right.
And so, and I get into this. This is why I am probably not as big a fan as democratic decision making as some others. And I don't mean that, I want to go to a dictatorship or anything like that. But democratic decision making isn't always the best way of doing certain things,
Sure,
depending on a context that you're looking at, right? But for large decisions that are going to be made for an entire population, there's not really a better way that serves the interest of the most people than having some democratic process of doing so, right? And for that to be held legitimate, though, people have to be feeling like they can work with each other, and they have to be able to trust the people on the other side, even if the outcome of that democratic decision process isn't what they wanted.
Right.
And when we can't have that kind of social cooperation underneath the surface, it makes viewing democracy as a legitimate way of making decisions much more problematic. We just see it as, on one side we want to declare that it was not legitimate at all to begin with, the election fraud, all of this kind of stuff. On the other side, sometimes you get this sense that if we've got 51 votes, we're going to ram whatever we want down your throat, right? That's not a healthy democracy either, right? There has to be some respect there for if you've got a sizable majority who's opposed to something, not saying that they should be able to block everything, but you ought to take that into account a little bit more than what I see us doing, especially at the national level.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, working with people is messy. The majority is not always right. Sometimes, right? Like there's points in American history where the majority was
absolutely wrong.
Absolutely wrong. And those occasions, like the structures we have are sometimes appreciated more, right? And at least in retrospect. And I think probably more to your point, the thing that I struggle with, and this is me, Andy, not on behalf of any organization, but a lot of the activity in this civic realm, not just politics, but civics, is oriented around winning.
Yes.
Right? Instead of, I don't know, growing, building, just doing it for charitable reasons. And in fact, in your non-doc article, you gave kind of like 5 or 6 bullet points about the Heterodox Academy and their perspectives. And one of them says, being intellectually charitable, assume the reasonable, informed, and intelligent people may disagree with you. And I think that does feel charitable, right? Like in a way of like, this person, we might disagree, but it doesn't make them less than me. It doesn't make them dumb, or it doesn't necessarily even make them wrong. Like we might just disagree on something. And it's easy if you and I can discuss our favorite flavors of ice cream. We might not, agree that it's Bluebell homemade vanilla, which is the correct answer. But I'm not going to think like, God, James is such an idiot. Like he's clearly an autocrat. He's some crazy libertarian. He likes mint chocolate. I don't know. What's your favorite flavor?
Oh, it's just plain chocolate.
Okay.
That's it.
Even a starker example, vanilla and chocolate, right? So those kinds of things we should be mindful about when it comes to other stuff too. And heck, like find ways to be involved in your community that aren't about winning.
Right.
It blows people's minds when I say that, we promote voting, period. Like that we try to get people registered and to vote. Even when we do like a voter registration drive, I'll have people of all party affiliations. I'll be like, hey, you registered to vote? They're like, oh, yeah, but I'm a whatever, assuming that we're not. And I'm like,
right.
I don't care, man. Like you should register to vote, right? Like this is, in an ideal world, it's 100% voting. Everyone votes. And we really know what the people want. Like that's never going to happen. But I think there are ways that we can do this. And of silly, I don't know if it's silly. An example I think of is Jimmy Carter, who, left office fairly disliked for a long time, has been kind of viewed as a failed president. But for most of my life, like, all I know that he's done is built houses for Habitat for Humanity, right?
Right.
And I think all the time that, like, if Americans were compelled to do nothing else than to show up one day a month to help build houses with their neighbors, and you're just like randomly assigned, you would have so many more positive relationships with people because you're joined in something that is a task that needs to be done, that is doing good for the world around you. And it doesn't care what your opinion is about hammers or nails or whatever. Like, you're joined in this building a better world for somebody. And we can do that in other ways in our community, regardless of partisanship.
That's exactly right. And the goal should be, how do we live better with one another?
Yeah.
Right? How do we live better with one another? And our politics should arise out of that perspective. Today, that's not the perspective that we have, that we see. It is all about winning. If you get on social media, it's all about winning.
Yeah.
And that is not healthy. It's not sustainable, quite frankly. And if we could get back to, and so my beef with, or my disagreement with, it used to be just kind of my progressive friends. Now it's this group of conservative friends too, is that living better together often means you don't need government making a bunch of decisions to help us do that. Mm-hmm. That's not to say you don't need a government at all. I'm not an anarchist, and as a political scientist, I think government's necessary. It's got to do some things. It's got to do some really basic things if we want to be able to live together well. But I think sometimes we expect too much from our political systems. We expect too much for them to accomplish that government simply is not suited to accomplish. And so, and everything, today, if I get on social media, it's hard for me to stay on social media for very long because it's just so negative. Yeah. But it's like, oh, well, we should do this or we should do that. And well, maybe you should. Maybe that would be good for you to do, but do you really need to coerce everybody else into doing that as well? Right? I don't want my child reading that book. That's great. Don't let them read that book. But do you really want to compel everybody else to abide by your rule, right? And I think there's too many on both sides of the spectrum that are willing to use the coercive power of the state to impose their vision of the good life on other people. Right. And I think that's harmful as well.
Yeah, I mean, my 4-year-old has some books that my wife and I loathe reading to her, but she loves them, and it's like, it's not causing any harm, and we're not going to ban the book from our house because she likes it. I think you're right, and your note about social media reminded me this week at this conference, I was talking with 2 colleagues who, like me, really got involved in civic engagement world through social media. We all started organizations in 2016 or 2017. That it was me, and then it was Katie Fahey, who runs an organization called The People up in Michigan. She ran the redistricting ballot campaign in 2018 up there called Voters Not Politicians. And then Emma, whose last name escapes me right now, but she is one of the co-founders of Mormon Women for Ethical Government, which started around the same time. And we have all had the conversation of Emma Adams, that's her last name. But we all had the same conversation that, like, when we started this on, like, we all made Facebook posts at some point, and that's like what kicked off a bunch of relationships, because 6 years ago or 8 years ago in 2016 and 2017, social media was more social, and there was like more of a relational aspect where you could have conversations and build relationships. And we all have said, like, we'll tell you about what we did, but you can't replicate it today in the same way, right? There's not the same kind of forum. And in fact, Mormon Women for Ethical Government, it just launched a couple of weeks ago, basically a social network for their membership, because they've been based around Facebook, and they have evolved, and so is Facebook, and not necessarily together. Like, it's not as useful of a tool. It's harder to beat the algorithm and all that kind of stuff, and just harder to cut through the noise of everything else. Even if you have a robust Facebook group or page, the moment someone logs in, they don't immediately go to that stuff, right? They got to see all the ads and all the other things and beep, bop, boop, whatever. And they may never even make it to the page they came to visit. And so we collectively have to find ways to create new connections in the world. Ideally ones, I think, that exist in person, right? Like having conversations, meeting for coffee or drinks or lunch with one another and building those relationships. And it is harder. It takes more time, but it is so much more rewarding than just like hopping on Twitter and firing off a 2-sentence hot take about what the governor just did or whatever.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was talking about the lack of meaningful relationships that people have, seems like today, right? And this one was kind of focused on a little bit, not entirely, but a little bit on especially the problem among men who don't have good friendships and deep relationships and the problem there. And I think that, again, comes back to we have allowed, in some cases, politics, in some cases, ideology, in some cases, religion or whatever. We've allowed one thing to be the essence of everything. And those who aren't in that one thing are now, they're not just different, they're hostile to us in some way.
Right.
And so we can't reach out and say, you know what, even though this person thinks differently, prays to a different God than I do, belongs to a different political party than I do, I think I can still be friends with them, and I think we can still provide each other, emotional support or whatever. It seems to be very, very challenging in today's world.
And even when it comes to partisanship, not just, oh, they're a different party and we're still friends. I hear that a lot. I'm like, hey, I've got lots of friends that are Republican, which is in some ways the modern day equivalent. Someone's like, I've got lots of black friends. And you're like, I feel like you're trying to make up for something here. But often that it's okay to disagree with people that might share your party affiliation, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
and I think you had this in your article too of, to be a Republican and to say some of Republicans are wrong on these issues, right?
Right.
Like I know a lot of people that are people of faith who are Republicans who really don't like the amount of religiosity that's being injected into our political system.
Yeah.
I have a lot of Democratic friends who don't like the woke purity test when it comes to selecting candidates or to their position on things, and they feel it's off-putting, right? And in fact, next week, I think in D.C., there's a conference called the Principles First Conference or Coalition. A guy named Heath Mayo is kind of organized, and he's got a bunch of high-profile speakers, Adam Kinzinger and folks like that have kind of been in that mix of like walking both sides of the line. That's not always the case. Speaking up for their party and calling out things they think is bad. And in many cases, they've been, effectively excommunicated for doing so. And if we are being, if we are cutting off people with whom we agree on 90% of things because we disagree on 10%,
right?
Like we are going to hollow out our country.
That's exactly right. And you see this, on the Republican side, you see this with that term rhino.
Right.
Oh, and today, a rhino just has to be someone who disagrees with you on one thing, and they must be a rhino. Because, or not to poke too many bears, but if they disagree with Donald Trump, they're a rhino, right? And I'm looking at some of these folks, and I'm like, they've been reliably conservative for a really long time.
Right.
To call them a rhino doesn't seem to be entirely accurate. But
I saw Senator Langford at the airport on Sunday as he was presumably getting ready to head back to D.C. And given the last couple of weeks he's had with his immigration bill and really like taking the brunt of his party's dissatisfaction with their inability to pass some policy. I mean, he put forth a policy on immigration that the Democrats would not have even entertained 2 years ago. And the fact that the Republicans were the ones that lampooned it he was just getting a cup of coffee and looked a little defeated. No, it was early in the morning, maybe to his credit, but I was, I wanted to walk over and just be like, hey man, sorry about your couple of weeks. Like, I'm sure it's hard. but as a good example of like, in what world is James Langford not like a firm core member of the Republican conservative majority here that should be able to pass policy?
Right. That whole scenario just flabbergasted me as I'm watching that play out. And you're exactly right. That would have been a conservative win.
Yeah.
Had that passed,
Yeah.
it would have been it would have been some of the strictest enforcement of the border, more funds to border protection and border patrol, all of these kind of things that conservatives have been saying they wanted.
Right.
He was selected by leadership in the Senate to negotiate this on behalf of the Republicans, and he's just undercut.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And whether or not people could say, well, I didn't really think that was a great bill, or that's fine. But it just shows the difficulty of getting anything done in Congress today, because let's not play around here. The only reason that didn't happen is because the leading Republican presidential candidate said it will hurt my chances of winning in the fall if that passes.
Right.
And they're like, oh yeah, we can't do that.
Right. Never mind that the single biggest issue in voters' minds this year is like on the table.
Right.
Like, that's an issue that's bigger than who the president is, and yet this guy came in and undercut the whole thing.
Exactly right.
Yeah, that's tough. Congress, right, famously has had a abysmal favorability rating for decades. Right, it's down in below 20% for sure of the number of Americans that approve of the job that Congress is doing, and yet members of Congress are reelected at like greater than 90%, right?
Right.
But everyone says Congress is terrible. Oh, but I like my guy. And we have to at some point like recognize that this is not always the case. In fact, I have a friend who recently went to D.C. for the first time with a business group in his industry to do some lobbying. And so I talked to him after he got back. He was like, this is wild. He's like, he'd never been there before, and it was really cool to go in and talk to people. And one of their first meetings was with Jeff Sessions, and they said that we want to talk about allowing community banks to accept money from like cannabis industry businesses, right? Which is right now like mostly prohibited under federal law. And I guess Sessions' reply was like a very quick and immediate, no way, because that money comes from drugs. Those drug dealers use the money to build cartels, and the cartels will kill your children. And my friend was just like, what? Like, that was a really quick, and like you went in a way different direction than I was even prepared for. And he said that was our first meeting, and it was jarring. And then he realized that all the other meetings they had were similar, and that he was like, his phrasing was, members of Congress didn't even talk to us like people. Like you could like see him glaze over and just like repeat the talking points. He's like, up before that, we had to just chit chat. It was really warm and it was totally normal and like a normal person until it came to a policy thing and just flipped. And then other guys in the room were all like, oh, I've had the same experience. I went to this town hall meeting for my member of Congress, and they'd all had the similar experience. And they said, like, what is it about Congress that like turns these regular folks like into weird partisan robots?
And it's not, trust me, it's not just Congress, because I've had conversations down at the same state legislature with folks very much the same, right? Yeah. I'm almost convinced there's some entity within the legislature, these legislative bodies, that says, we're going to teach you to talk like a legislator now.
Right.
And you're going to communicate in this way. And you're not going to have kind of the common back and forth. You can't do that anymore. You need to have this, and you got to stick to your points and that kind of thing. Yeah. It's not always helpful. And quite frankly, that kind of communication, I think, is one of the things that led to the rise of somebody like Donald Trump, because he doesn't talk like that. Right. He is completely the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Not saying that that's good,
Sure.
but the fact that he flouts all of the traditional political conventions, the fact that he doesn't let himself be constrained by what traditional politicians seem to be constrained by, I think has worked in his favor as far as amassing a group of people who say, finally, somebody who's just going to say it like it is. Right. Whether or not he actually is or not, that's how they feel.
Right. No, yeah, you hear that all the time from his supporters that say, like, he just says it how it is.
Right.
And it was refreshing in some way to not toe the party line. Of course, now the way he talks has become the party line, right? Like, people have aligned to him. It also makes me wonder, and this is probably being very Pollyanna-ish, but like, if he can deviate from that accepted norm so far in one direction, is it possible for someone to deviate in the other direction? That is like to be a speaker and to use rhetoric that is more open and loving and like bridge building than it is like tearing down. And now there's a discussion about love versus everything that and power. So probably not. Those people who are good at that kind of rhetoric tend to get killed, whether it's Jesus or Martin Luther King or Abraham Lincoln. The other side tends to get mad about that.
It is a struggle to communicate in those terms. Oftentimes, you're viewed as weak or compromising or something along those terms. In more worse scenarios, you're considered a traitor to whatever side you're supposed to be on. Right. And so I think in today's environment, it is awfully challenging to speak in those kind of terms, which is unfortunate. I mean, we do that in a lot of other places, right? I can go to a lot of churches and they use that kind of language. I can go to a lot of civic clubs and they use that kind of language of inclusivity and hey, we're here as a community to get along. But it seems like once we translate ourselves from those kinds of perhaps more intimate environments to the environment of politics, all of a sudden it's like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And that's a shame. I mean, that kind of language should have a place in our politics as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Well, James, I think we're about at our time for today. This has been delightful.
Oh, thank you. No, I have enjoyed this very much.
Please come back anytime. You and I talked around a lot of stuff. I imagine our next episode, we should throw down a couple of policies and actually debate them.
We probably should talk about things like the minimum wage or school choice or some stuff like that. Yeah. I suspect there are some issues that we would find we don't really disagree on it. We might come from different ends, but when we get to a discussion, there might be a lot of common ground there.
Yeah.
Other issues, maybe not so much, but that's part of the fun of having conversations.
Well, and my commitment to you and everybody else is that I do try to approach conversations with, a charitable disposition towards the other and a willingness to change my mind, right? Like the number one indicator if someone will change their mind is their own willingness to be open to changing their mind. So I've tried to foster that curiosity in myself.
And I appreciate it. I think that we all need to have this kind of humility that I could be wrong. I might not know everything, and I might not be right about everything that I think I know. And so if we could all approach things a little bit more that way, we could reduce some of the conflict that's going on, I think.
100%. Well, my guest today has been Professor James Davenport from Rose State College. James, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Thanks for being with us. It is already the middle of February. Session at the state capitol is clicking along. We have not covered a lot of it yet because, in the early days, there's lots of bills that get pressed that are terrible bills. And it is hard to focus on what really matters and what really has some legs. As that becomes more clear, as we move along, we will certainly have more coverage of that. As I mentioned earlier, Shannon Fleck will return here hopefully next week with some follow-up about that, and we'll just keep on keeping on. Also, before you go, I'm going to fade this music out, and then I'm going to play a clip from The Daily Show with Jon Stewart from this Monday. He came back on Monday. I was surprised. I didn't know what was happening, and it was really great. So stick around for just about another minute, and we'll play that clip.
The next 9 months or so, and maybe more than that depending on the coup schedule, they're gonna suck. You're gonna be getting emails with insane subject lines like, "Hello, John, it's Chuck Schumer." Donald Trump is right behind you with a knife. Donate. You're going to get inundated with robocalls and push polls and real polls, and people are going to tell you to rock the vote and be the vote and vote the vote and finger bang the vote. And it's all going to make you feel like Tuesday, November 5th is the only day that matters. And that day does matter. But man, November 6th ain't nothing to sneeze at, or November 7th. If your guy loses, bad things might happen. But the country is not over. And if your guy wins, the country is in no way saved. I've learned one thing over these last 9 years, and I was glib at best and probably dismissive at worst about this. The work of making this world resemble one that you would prefer to live in is a lunch pail job, day in and day out, where thousands of committed, anonymous, smart, and dedicated people bang on closed doors and pick up those that are fallen and grind away on issues till they get a positive result, and even then have to stay on to make sure that result holds. So the good news is, I'm not saying you don't have to worry about who wins the election. I'm saying you have to worry about every day before it and every day after, forever. Although, on the plus side, I am told that at some point, the sun will run out of hydrogen.